All right, everybody, the NBA playoffs march on. And, yeah, the first round has completed, and now we're on to the second round. And things are going to pick up a bit as we preview the 2024 second-round NBA playoff matchups. And we have him back on the program. He is the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast and editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Let's welcome him back to the program, Nick Agar-Johnson. Hey, Nick, welcome back, my man.
Ed, thanks so much for having me back. It's always great to talk basketball with you, and obviously it's an exciting time of year. We're in the conference semifinals, so the road to the finals is already starting to look clearer than it was, and there's a lot of great basketball ahead still, so looking forward to breaking it down with you.
Absolutely. Same here, my friend. And as always, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us on the program. Let's start over on the Eastern Conference. So the Boston Celtics handled their business. They took care of the Miami Heat in a 5-game series. Miami was decimated with injuries. Jimmy Butler, just to name a few. Boston came of age in this series, so to speak. We knew Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown would handle their business along with Al Horford, also Hauser, Pritchett and company, also Drew Holiday, and of course we saw Derek White. He really took on a major leadership and he moved leaps and bounds in this series, and they're going to be going up against the Cleveland Cavaliers that went through a very underrated 7-game series against an emerging Orlando Magic. No Jared Allen for the last several games of that series, but they had Evan Mobley. Also, Isaac Okoro stepped up on the defensive side. Max Strus came in when necessary. Oh, yeah, and also Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell. He was pretty effective as well. So now we have our second-round matchup with the Boston Celtics going up against the Cleveland Cavaliers. Give me your take on this series.
Yeah, so starting with the Boston side of things, it's kind of interesting because, they've been, at the top of the Eastern Conference for a while, but really this season was these, as you sort of mentioned, they came into their own in a lot of ways. This season was, different from the Celtics iterations of years past in that they were the clear number one team, not just in the Eastern Conference, but record-wise, the number one team in the NBA. And, again, this team has been percolating for a while. Obviously, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have been running the show in Boston for many years now. And, this is a team that's made title runs before, made challenges at the title, even though they haven't won in a number of years, but, challenged the Eastern Conference crown for a while. But this year really has been the year of the Boston Celtics. And, looking back at that first-round series, as you mentioned, I mean, Derek White really was the standout player for the Celtics. I mean, he's almost been so thoroughly discussed as underrated by this point that he's almost gotten to the point where he's properly rated, but I think he showed once again in that first-round series against the Miami Heat that he really is a, near all-star, if not all-star caliber player, and certainly this season has been an excellent one for him and the Celtics, but that first-round series was, again, really a sort of coming-out party for him for the few people around the NBA world who weren't quite aware of what Derek White can be. And then, on the other side with the Cavaliers, they had a spectacular first-round series against the Magic. For my money, anyway, the most fun series that we got in the first round of the playoffs. But Donovan Mitchell was just absolutely lights out in the final 2 games of that series. And, Cleveland ended up having enough to come out on top, but it was a spectacular series for Paulo Banchero, who, similarly to Derek White, except for the fact that Paulo, I think, is another tier above, but, he really sort of announced himself to the few people in the NBA world who weren't quite aware that Paulo Banchero is among that next wave of superstars, on their way to take over the NBA. But ultimately, Donovan Mitchell did prove the difference for the Cavaliers in that first-round series. And, this Cavaliers team has been very interesting in that for a few months, they were, among the best teams in basketball. And outside of that, they've been very up and down. But, certainly when they're at their best, they are one of the teams in the Eastern Conference that at least challenged the Celtics for a few months in terms of, being one of the more dominant teams in the NBA. Their inconsistencies aside, when they're at their best, they are one of the few teams in the East that I think can really challenge these Boston Celtics.
Yeah, Cleveland definitely has a challenge to challenge Boston. We know how so strong Boston was on the offensive side and defensively as well. But Cleveland has the defensive stalwarts in this particular series. We mentioned with Evan Mobley, also Darius Garland, and then Jared Allen, when he's healthy, one of the best in the league. Before we go more into detail about the Boston and the Cleveland series, you mentioned about the Orlando Magic. We talked about Oklahoma City being ahead of schedule and jumping leaps and bounds in terms of their development, and they've gotten so good in such a short amount of time. Orlando, no one expected this, and credit to Coach of the Year candidate Jamal Mosley doing what he's done this year. Just give me your thoughts on Orlando and taking those next steps like Oklahoma City has done.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been interesting in that this Orlando team has started strong for a number of years, but the last couple of years, they started strong and then sort of faded quickly. This year's Orlando team, they started strong, and even though they had a sort of rough patch around December, January, they stayed the course, and, they made their way into the playoffs as one of these surprise teams, as you mentioned. And a ton of credit, of course, has to go to Coach Mosley, who did a fantastic job with this Orlando group. But, there's also the element to which, this is a team that, as you mentioned, sort of similar to Oklahoma City, they have the young pieces to be around for a while. And, maybe it would have been nice if they could have, made it past the Cleveland Cavaliers. But, for a team that was 13th in the Eastern Conference just last season, I think they were stronger than that on paper, but, ultimately this year they proved what they can be when they do have all those pieces clicking. And it'll be fascinating to see what this team does in the offseason. There are certainly, for a team that was as incredibly successful as this Magic team was, there are certainly a number of areas that they could address that would, open things up for this team even further. But even without that, I mean, it's unfortunate for them that they ultimately go down in that first-round series, but they put up a real fight, and they are a team that is going to be a problem for Eastern Conference opponents to deal with for years to come. I mean, they are only on the way up. When you talk about the young core of this team, I mean, Paulo Banchero, this is his age 21 season. Franz Wagner, his age 22 season. Jalen Suggs, his age 22 season. Cole Anthony, his age 23 season. This is a very young team that has a ton of room to grow, and it'll be awesome to see where they go. But even where they're at right now, they're a team that is way ahead of schedule, and a lot of credit goes to coach. A lot of credit goes to Paulo as sort of the leader of this team. But this Magic squad was a ton of fun to watch already, and it'll be very interesting to see what they do this offseason. They could very easily sort of do what Oklahoma City did. Last year the Thunder were a team that was lower down the standings, but, they retooled a little bit and came back as the best team in the Western Conference. It would not surprise me at all if the Orlando Magic are very comfortably a top 4 seed, home court advantage team when we're looking at the playoffs next season.
You're absolutely right about that. Big markets matter in the NBA, but so do small markets. And it's always great when you have a balance in power. You have the balance between the big market teams and the small market teams. And certainly Orlando that franchise has had their share of great stars with the likes of Shaquille O'Neal, Penny Hardaway, also Dwight Howard, Jameer Nelson, just to name a few. And now we've got a future star, on his way to being a superstar, Paulo Banchero, and the other gentleman that you mentioned with the likes of Franz Wagner and Jalen Suggs, and, of course, Cole Anthony and Jonathan Isaac, just to name a few. So definitely Orlando is on their way, and with a great coach with Jamal Mosley. All right, so, Nick, let's get to it. We've got Boston and Cleveland. The names, the history of these two franchises, right? A guy by the name of LeBron James had 2 stints in Cleveland. He knew about Boston very well, and he spoiled some playoff hopes. The last time that Boston and Cleveland played in the Eastern Conference Finals was 2018. That was LeBron's last run in Cleveland, and it ended in a 7-game series. So this is going to be the 9th playoff meeting between these two teams. Each team has won 4 series apiece. So we mentioned the names with Tatum and Brown and Drew Holiday, Derek White, so on and so forth, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, Darius Garland. All right, who wins in how many games and why?
I'm going to say that this ends up being Boston, and I'm going to say in 5 games. I think the Jarrett Allen injury is particularly brutal for this Cavaliers squad because, really I think the one way that this Cleveland Cavaliers team was going to have a chance to attack this Boston Celtics squad was, sort of down low. I mean, the big man tandem between Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley is a very difficult proposition for any team to deal with, but I mean, especially when you're talking about the Celtics, Kristaps Porzingis and Al Horford are 2 exceptionally talented big men, but they don't particularly match up well, especially when it comes to the rebounding side. I mean, Jarrett Allen's one of the best rebounders in the league. Evan Mobley isn't, he struggles on the glass sometimes, but, compared to Kristaps Porzingis and Al Horford, that's certainly an area where, particularly when you have a tandem of Allen and Mobley, that Cleveland might have had a chance to sort of give the Celtics problems down low. But with Allen's health, questionable for the series overall, and, certainly doesn't seem like he's going to be playing to start the series, I think that this is going to be a very difficult hill for Cleveland to climb. So if Jarrett Allen were healthy, I think I might be more willing to say this might be a 6 or even a 7-game series. But with Allen's health in question, I'm going to say Boston in 5.
Wow, that's interesting right there. I like Boston as well, but I've got Boston in 6, though. But we'll see. I mean, hey, this is, Boston is at the peak of their powers right now, but Cleveland definitely has something to say about that. So that takes care of our first Eastern Conference semifinal series with the number 1 seed Boston Celtics going up against the 4th seed Cleveland Cavaliers. Let's move over now to the other Eastern Conference final series between the New York Knicks and the Indiana Pacers. We'll get into Knicks and Pacers in just a moment. Now, Nick, we talked about the Cleveland and Orlando series. In my opinion, that was the second best first-round series of all the playoffs. The best series in the first round was clearly Knicks and 76ers. We've had conversations about these 2 cities, New York and Philadelphia, not just culturally dynamic, but both cities love their sports, rabid sports cities. And certainly this is what sports is all about, right? 2 cities less than 2 hours away from one another, jockeying for supremacy along that I-95 corridor along the New Jersey Turnpike. And this was a lot of moments. And this was also, we saw Joel Embiid. His toughness was questioned. We saw the emergence of Tyrese Maxey. Oh, and we also saw a superstar that was made by the name of Jalen Brunson. Give me your thoughts on the Knicks and 76ers series.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I completely agree that the 2 best series in the first round were on the Eastern Conference side of the bracket with the Orlando-Cleveland matchup and then with the Knicks-Sixers matchup. I mean, New York and Philadelphia have been sports rivals for as long as there's been professional sports in this country. So, certainly there's a history there that goes, well beyond just the NBA teams, really just all of any sort of sports matchup you're going to get between New York and Philadelphia. It's always going to be a raucous arena. It's always going to be a great time. And yeah, I mean, certainly, on the Philadelphia side, Joel Embiid didn't have his best series, but, there's certainly the element of him coming back from injury only right before the playoffs began, which, makes anything sort of difficult on that side of things. But man, you mentioned it. I mean, Jalen Brunson was he was a superstar in this series. And, he's been sort of on the verge of that sort of superstar breakout. He's been a star for the Knicks and certainly, a team and a city that has a long-established love of point guards and a long-established difficulty at the point guard spot basically since the Linsanity days. And, man, I mean, when you talk about Jalen Brunson, just instantly came in and became an all-star for this Knicks team. And, now he's an all-NBA type player. But really, I think for a lot of basketball fans around the world, this is going to be, when Jalen Brunson sort of announced himself to the world as, no, I'm not just an all-star player. I am a superstar that can carry the mantle of being the point guard for the New York Knicks, which, is a tougher burden to bear than being the starting point guard pretty much anywhere else in professional basketball. And Jalen Brunson has worn that mantle like an absolute champion in a way that nobody has in New York for many, many, many years. And certainly if people weren't aware of the kind of player that Jalen Brunson is before that first-round series, they are now. And, even with, as you mentioned, absolutely heroic effort from Tyrese Maxey to keep the Sixers afloat, Jalen Brunson won that guard matchup pretty handily, and given how spectacular Tyrese Maxey was, that's an even more impressive statement than it would be otherwise.
Absolutely. And before we just kind of go into the Knicks and Pacers preview, I got to ask you, where in the world was Tobias Harris in Game 7? No points. I don't. This was really. I'm sorry. In Game 6, in the elimination game, no points in Game 6. Where in the world was Tobias, Nick?
I wish I could answer that question. It's fascinating to me in that it almost feels like there wasn't any other way that Tobias Harris's stint as a Philadelphia 76er could end. It's not out of the question, technically, that he resigns, but I would be very surprised if Tobias Harris is a member of the Philadelphia 76ers next season. I mean, basically since the moment that he signed that max deal, there was a disconnect between the solid value that Tobias Harris provides. I mean, he is one of the, top half of starting forwards in the league, certainly, but the gap between what he was being paid by the Sixers and what they presumably expected him to provide for this team versus, what he was actually able to do out there on the basketball court was always a pretty significant gap. And, it's, again, fitting in a way that presumably anyway, the last game of his career for the 76ers was him disappearing, as you mentioned, him sort of not living up to the expectations and not living up to the level that he needed to reach to be sort of the third star for the Sixers team like he was paid to be. And, it's not like his contract was a complete loss. I mean, certainly with Lonzo Ball recently picking up the final year of his deal with the Chicago Bulls where he hasn't played basketball for 2.5 years, Tobias Harris was out there, pretty much every day. I mean, he's been a regular mainstay for this Sixers squad, since he signed that deal. But, again, there's just been that sort of disconnect between the sort of superstar level at which he was getting compensated and the, actual level of his play out there on the basketball court.
Yeah, man, that was a tough go, as the name of that show. It's always sunny in Philadelphia, but it was not sunny for Tobias in that Game 6. And certainly, if you know Philadelphia and those sports fans, they had a mouthful for Tobias Harris. So that takes care of a thrilling first round series between New York and Philadelphia. All right, so Nick, let's stay with the New York Knicks. So Jalen Brunson emerged as a superstar in that thrilling first-round series against the 76ers. But not just Jalen Brunson, but also we had OG Anunoby, a healthy OG Anunoby, not just on the offensive side. You know what a dog he is on the defensive side. And how about Jalen's college teammates from Villanova, Josh Hart, Dante DiVincenzo? They stepped up, and also on the defense and the rebounding side, Isaiah Hartenstein, Mitchell Robinson, very effective. And then we saw what the Knicks did in that series against the Sixers. How about the Indiana Pacers? I hate to break the news to you, but Tyrese Halliburton, they had no problems taking care of the Milwaukee Bucks. No Giannis, Damian Lillard was in and out of the series, hampered with injuries, but the Pacers handled their business. Tyrese Halliburton, also Nesmith handled his business. Miles Turner was effective. T.J. McConnell brought the heat on the defensive side. Just kind of give me your thoughts on this preview we're seeing with the Knicks and the Pacers.
Yeah, so since, we already talked about the Knicks a little bit, just to start here with the Pacers, I mean, I think that, injury aside, certainly that was, really the big upset of the first round, which, wasn't that much of an upset, just purely because, again, as you mentioned, Giannis, missing the series, Dame Lillard, being only sporadically available, missing a couple games, and obviously not being 100% even when he was out there. So, there is an element to which this Pacers team is ahead of schedule. I mean, certainly, they didn't have quite as dramatic a rise this season as the Orlando Magic did, but, they're also a team that finished out of the play-in picture last year and went from out of the play-in to firmly in the playoffs as the 6th seed. And, now they're advancing to the second round, which, again, is a bit ahead of schedule. I mean, from my perspective, this is not the perspective of all Kings fans, and I recognize that. But from my perspective, I'm just always happy when good things happen to Tyrese Halliburton because he was such a wonderful member of the Sacramento Kings. And, from every account that I have heard of him, just, a great guy to be around and someone who, elevates the locker room even, sort of beyond when we're talking about the basketball court. But when we're talking about what he does on the basketball court, I mean, just absolutely superlative passer, one of the best passers in the NBA, always looking to get his guys open. And, I think because he's such an incredible passer, there's sort of an element to which his scoring goes a bit under the radar. But, he's someone who from day one in the NBA was, one of the better three-point shooters in the league. And certainly this year, he's had to take on, he put up more shot attempts from three-point range than he ever had before in his NBA career. And, he's someone, again, who is one of the young faces of the league. And this Indiana Pacers team, again, it's a bit ahead of schedule. And, certainly an element to that is that, the Pascal Siakam trade in the middle of the season certainly helped bolster, have them sort of get a second star alongside Halliburton. But you mentioned Miles Turner. I mean, I brought up Derek White earlier as someone who's been underrated for so long that he might be approaching properly rated. I think Miles Turner is still just underrated, and what he does on the defensive end, what he does as a big man who can space the floor, who can run out in transition, who can have the ball go through his hands without you sort of being worried about what he's going to do with it. He's, I think, one of the more underrated big men in the league, and certainly helps the Pacers offense hum and helps them stay afloat defensively. Certainly without Turner, I worry about what the Pacers team might be like on the defensive end. But with him in the fold, I mean, they're a team that can hurt you in so many different ways. Broke the NBA record for, points, well, not, but, was close to breaking the NBA record for offensive rating. They were on pace to have the highest offensive rating in league history for much of the season. Just a spectacular team when it comes to putting the ball through the basket. And, that really starts, of course, with Tyrese Halliburton as the head of the attack. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I mean, this Pacers team, got a bit of a break in that first round against Milwaukee, but, they still had to beat a Milwaukee team that was among the best in the league, even with Giannis and Dame sort of hobbled by injury. And it'll be fascinating to see where this Pacers team goes. I think they might not have been as bright a flame as the Orlando Magic in terms of, Orlando was below them in the standings last season and, jumped above them in the standings by the end of this season. But I think it's underrated just how young this Pacers team is and how much room they have ahead of them to grow.
You know what, before we get into the predictions and how many games and stuff, we know about the Knicks and Pacers rivalry in the 90s, right, with Reggie Miller, Spike Lee, Patrick Ewing, John Starks, just to name a few. Do you think this has the potential, Nick, of maybe this particular series leaving up the potential of this series being like the quote-unquote glory days of the 90s and the early 2000s with the Pacers and Knicks, or do you think this is more of a different situation?
It's funny because I think that the way that the game will look will be very different because, those Knicks teams, those 90s Knicks teams were even more of a sort of defense first, foul everybody incredibly hard on every play, kind of, rough and tumble defense first squads. And, this Knicks team is certainly like that, but I think with, the current Pacers squad being what they are, I think this game's going to be a lot more up and down than people sort of expected from those 90s rivalries. But, in terms of the other stuff, I mean, these are two teams that have a long and storied history, and, the point guard matchup between Tyrese Halliburton and Jalen Brunson is going to be fascinating to watch, even if it's not as sort of a physical sort of situation as, John Starks, Mark Jackson, Reggie Miller, all those guys. It's going to be a matchup between two teams that have a lot of history. And, certainly, I mean, when you talk about cities that absolutely love their basketball, New York and Indianapolis are are up among the, top of the top, and this is a rivalry that's been around for a long time. So I think the basketball might look a bit different just because of the way that, these two teams played as opposed to the way these two teams played in the 90s, and also just because of the way the NBA is now as opposed to the way it was in the 90s. But, there's a lot of history here, and these are two teams that are going to definitely try and get at each other in incredibly different ways. I mean, you're talking about the team with the second fastest pace in the league in Indiana versus the team that slowed it down more than any other team in the NBA this season in the 30th paced New York Knicks. So it's going to be interesting to see sort of which style sets the fight between these two teams. And that's going to be a bit different than the 90s just because both of those teams were so physical. But there's a lot of history here, and it'll certainly be fun to see how that plays out.
Absolutely, and you're right about these two cities, New York and Indianapolis. They love their basketball, and certainly it is going to be a feeding frenzy in this series between the number 2 seed New York Knicks and the 6 seed Indiana Pacers. And by the way, this will be the 8th playoff meeting between these two teams, with the Pacers winning 4 out of the first 7 meetings. All right, so the verdict, I need it, Nick. Who wins and how many games and why?
I'm going to say Knicks in 6. I think that ultimately the depth of this Knicks team is just going to be too much for the Pacers to handle. I mean, you mentioned some of the guys up front, but OG Anunoby, since the trade has been revolutionary for this Knicks squad, and he had a fantastic first-round series on both ends of the floor. Josh Hart, I mean, New York and Indianapolis are two cities that appreciate the kind of hard-nosed, effort-first player that Josh Hart is more than almost anywhere else in the league, and he's certainly someone who has rapidly become a fan favorite in New York, and I think he's going to play a huge role for them. The center tandem between Hartenstein and Mitchell Robinson is going to be a whole lot for Miles Turner to deal with, and with Turner, I think he's someone who can, still come out on top in that matchup, but the Knicks just keep having weapons to throw at you. I mean, Dante DiVincenzo, as you mentioned, just so many different pieces for this Knicks squad. I think that ultimately, it'll probably be a pretty tight battle between the starting lineups for these two teams, but once it gets to the bench, I think the Knicks just have too many weapons for the Pacers to handle. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think it's going to be a close series. I think it's going to be an absolute showcase for both Jalen Brunson and Tyrese Haliburton, but ultimately, I think the Knicks have enough to take the series, so I'm going to say New York Knicks in 6.
All right, and definitely both home crowds are going to be rocking in this series. Indiana, they play at Gainbridge Fieldhouse in downtown Indianapolis, and the mecca of basketball, Madison Square Garden in New York City, never a dull moment in the Big Apple. So we have the number 2 seed New York Knicks going up against the 6 seed Indiana Pacers. Let's move over now to the Western Conference, Nick. We have the number 1 seed Oklahoma City Thunder going up against the 5th seed Dallas Mavericks. Let's start off with the number 1 seed Oklahoma City Thunder. The Thunder had no problems handling their business in the first round, beating the New Orleans Pelicans. Too skilled, too good, and too talented, right? Josh Giddey, Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams, both Jalen Williamses, I might add, Lou Dort, and a guy by the name of SGA, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's an MVP candidate. And also they have Mark Daigneault, who is the coach of the year for this year. So the Thunder took care of their business over New Orleans. For the Dallas Mavericks, tough go in the beginning, up and down series against the Los Angeles Clippers, but they were able to close it out. Daniel Gafford has emerged as a rim protector and a guy that could get points in the paint for the Mavericks. P.J. Washington, his shooting was solid. And also we can't forget about Luka Doncic and, of course, Kyrie Irving, who was the closer in Game 6. Give me your thoughts on the OKC going up against Dallas.
So starting on the OKC side of things, I mean, this is a team that, again, it was pretty clear last year that they were going to be a team to watch out for, that they were going to be a team on the rise, but I don't think I'm not even sure anybody with the Oklahoma City Thunder expected them to, break out and be the number 1 seed in the Western Conference. And, I mean, there's a huge element to which Chet Holmgren just revolutionized his team on both ends of the floor. I mean, from him going from missing his entire rookie season with a Liz Frank injury to playing all 82 games for the Thunder this year, just what he does on both ends of the floor. I mean, on defense, his ability to switch on to anybody, his ability to be an incredible amount of length in the paint. Maybe he isn't quite strong enough yet to sort of, bang with some of the biggest bodies in the NBA, but, I mean, even in his rookie year, he did a spectacular job of, staying competitive against those guys and just absolutely annihilating switches onto smaller guards who he could keep up with. And then, of course, on the offensive end, I mean, his ability to be someone who can handle the ball, who can shoot from deep, who can, get his way to the rim and convert around the basket, just the element that he opens up this offense, I think, is incredibly important to what the Thunder have been able to do. But, I mean, when you're talking about this Thunder squad, the two-headed monster of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Jalen Williams as sort of scoring threats. I mean, Shai, as you mentioned, one of the top MVP candidates, certainly, and, Jalen Williams is someone who, really has come into his own this year after proving himself as, a starting caliber player last season. He's taken yet another leap after being second in the Rookie of the Year voting last season, in the running for most improved player, too, which it's an interesting sort of proposition when you're talking about giving that to a second-year player. But, I mean, you're talking about a guy who was just absolutely lights out from everywhere on the floor, who, did an incredible job of, being an initiator when he had the ball in his hand, keeping the offense flowing when he was the main man. And, that's just the top three for this team. But you just go down the line, and there's so many incredible basketball players on this squad. I mean, we didn't even talk about Lou Dort yet, who's, one of the best defenders and, one of the best 3-and-D guys in the NBA. I mean, Josh Giddey, you mentioned, Cason Wallace came in as a rookie and also played all 82 games, was an incredibly important part of the Thunder bench. Going from Shai Gilgeous-Alexander to Cason Wallace is not, you'd hope for a bigger drop-off when you're taking Shai Gilgeous-Alexander out of the lineup, but with this Thunder squad, again, they have such an incredible amount of depth, and, I mean, all of their top guys, their top 6 players in terms of minutes per game are all, in their age 25 or younger seasons. So, even last year it was clear that this Thunder squad was on the rise, but they're already here. They're already number one in the Western Conference with an incredibly young squad. This Thunder team has a history of, putting together incredible young squads, but, this year's team has, risen to the top so quickly from being, the 10 seed last year. And, Chet Holmgren being in the lineup for them certainly plays a huge part in their sort of cohesion, but just across the board, this is an incredible team that can hurt you in so many different ways. And, going to the flip side of it with the Dallas Mavericks, I mean, the New York Knicks, made the big in-season trade that netted them OG Anunoby, and certainly he was a huge part of the season for them. But this Dallas team, might have been the team that was most positively affected by the trade deadline. I mean, them bringing in P.J. Washington, them bringing in Daniel Gafford, as you mentioned, just really shored up the rotation for them. This Mavericks team down the stretch of the season was a different team than the Mavericks team that started the season. And, it's no surprise that, right around the trade deadline, they rattled off a, 7-game win streak. They were one of the best teams in the NBA down the stretch run of the season. And a whole lot of that is because of the massive overhaul that they made to their roster partway through the season. And, it paid off for them in dramatic ways. I mean, P.J. Washington and Daniel Gafford have been huge parts of this squad. I mean, P.J. Washington has, at times been the sort of third guy for this Dallas Mavericks squad, sort of a third option offensively. And Daniel Gafford, I mean, Derek Lively II was doing a spectacular job as a 19-year-old center for the Mavericks, but there's, one level of Lively being the lob-catching, shot-blocking menace that he was, and the fact that they can just swap between those two guys with Daniel Gafford now also in the fold. And, I can't move on from Dallas without mentioning Derek Jones Jr., who really had a breakout season, going from being mostly a bench player, spot starter in some places throughout his career to, career high in three-point percentage, starting 66 games for the Mavericks squad. He wasn't as much in the rotation down the stretch after P.J. Washington came aboard, but he had a huge season, and it, should definitely not go under the radar that Derek Jones Jr. has been a hugely important part of the squad.
All right, and certainly both teams definitely handled their business, and we talked about just the impact players for both Oklahoma City and Dallas. All right, so Who wins and how many games and why?
I'm going to say Oklahoma City in 6. I was tempted to say 5, but I think that between Luka and Kyrie and, the new players that the Mavericks added, the second half of the season in P.J. Washington and Daniel Gafford, like I mentioned, I think that they can steal a game or two, but I think this Thunder team just has way too many weapons. And I think that, again, Dallas, anytime that you have Luka Doncic as the head of your offensive attack, you're going to have a chance against pretty much anybody, but I think this Thunder team just has too many weapons. And, if Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Luka Doncic sort of play each other to a standstill, I think that the Thunder have the advantage at pretty much every other slot. So I'm going to go with Thunder in 6. I, think the Mavericks can steal a couple games, but I would be surprised if Dallas ends up taking this series because I think this Oklahoma City squad is just way too strong across the board for this Dallas squad to be able to handle.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be a tough uphill climb for the Mavericks. Oklahoma City, so good and so skilled and definitely talented at the peak of their powers right now. So that's the number 1 seed, Oklahoma City Thunder, going up against the 5th seed Dallas Mavericks. And then the last Western Conference matchup in the second round, we have the defending champion Denver Nuggets, the number 2 seed, going up against the 3rd seed Minnesota Timberwolves. So let's start off with Denver for a moment. Tough first-round matchup against the Los Angeles Lakers. In my opinion, I thought this was the 3rd best series in the first round, even though the series only ended in 5 games. But Jamal Murray, not one, but 2 game-winning shots in this series. Jamal, when he's healthy, one of the best, and certainly he provided some clutch moments in that series. Nikola Jokic, a lot of people say the best player in the game right now, definitely at the peak of his powers right now. Michael Porter Jr., despite all of the distractions currently off the court, he's played at a high level in that, particularly in the series against the Lakers. Aaron Gordon doing what Aaron Gordon does best. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, despite battling an injury in that series against the Lakers, was still effective and came up with some key shots. And as for the Minnesota Timberwolves, listen, Karl Anthony Towns, in my opinion, the best shooting big man in the league. And then you've got Naz Reid, who is the 6th Man of the Year award winner. Rudy Gobert, defense, second to none, right? Mike Conley Jr., the veteran, the tried and true veteran, the mentor. Jaden McDaniels, he's solid as well. And there's a superstar by the name of Anthony Edwards. They just decimated the Phoenix Suns, swept them. That was a dominating performance by Minnesota. Give me your thoughts on the series with Denver and Minnesota.
Yeah, so starting on the Denver side, as you mentioned, that first-round series against the Lakers did only go to 5 games, but again, 2 of those came down to Jamal Murray game winners, and, all the other games were at least close, towards the end of the game. It was, I think, a lot tighter of a series than you usually sort of expect from a 5-game series, especially one that, the Nuggets only surrendered game 4 and then sort of closed out the gentleman's sweep in game 5. But, yeah, Jamal Murray, it was very interesting. He struggled throughout the series up until the 4th quarter, and then as soon as the 4th quarter hit, he was the Jamal Murray that everybody remembers from the bubble, the Jamal Murray that everybody remembers from, last year's Nuggets run. And, when he's on, there's a element to which, when teams have to gear in on Nikola Jokic the way that they do, and Michael Porter Jr., as you mentioned, is, running around getting himself open from 3-point range. When you have to deal with Jokic and Michael Porter Jr., there's only so much that even the best defense can focus on Jamal Murray, and that's when he kills you, is when, teams feel like, okay, we have to contain Nikola Jokic, we have to do our best on him. They forget just how much of a lethal player Jamal Murray is, especially when it gets down to crunch time. And, him closing out the Lakers, again, it was a tighter 5-game series than, you usually expect. Certainly it was a tighter 5-game series than the Celtics-Heat series, which was, also a 5-game first-round series. But, yeah, it's hard to bet against the defending champs, and certainly even though the Lakers gave them a tough battle and a tougher battle than the Lakers gave them in the playoffs last year, it's hard to bet against the defending champs, but it's also hard to bet against the Minnesota Timberwolves, and just a thoroughly dominating performance against a Phoenix Suns squad that, they had their struggles certainly throughout the regular season, definitely up and down regular season for the Phoenix Suns, but the expectation when you have a big three of Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal is that the playoffs are your time to shine. You sort of figure things out enough in the regular season, you get through to the playoffs, make sure everybody's healthy, and then that's your time to shine when you're the Phoenix Suns, and instead, Minnesota just destroyed them on both ends of the floor. And, the big man situation, the big man rotation of Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, and Naz Reid, how do you stop that? As you mentioned, Karl Anthony Towns, one of, if not the best shooting big man in the game today. Rudy Gobert, multiple-time Defensive Player of the Year winner who, for my money, has gotten much better as a sort of playoff/guard defender, over the past few years. Just his ability to stick with guards on switches has improved so much over the past couple seasons, and it's clearly made a difference. But really, the headline guy for the Minnesota Timberwolves this season and this playoffs has been Anthony Edwards. And, man, if Jalen Brunson announced himself as a superstar, Anthony Edwards absolutely put the exclamation point on his case as a superstar. And for him to do what he's done on both ends of the floor this season and this playoffs as a 22-year-old, it's something special. And certainly this, Minnesota Timberwolves squad has had their share not just of superstars, but specifically of number one overall picks. Andrew Wiggins, right, no longer with the team, but, someone who was a number one overall selection that spent a number of years in Minnesota. Karl Anthony Towns, if you want to go back even further, obviously this was Kevin Garnett's team for such a long time, but Anthony Edwards has announced himself as, the man on a squad that Karl Anthony Towns has been on for a number of years, but there's just something infectious about the energy that Anthony Edwards brings on both ends of the floor, the, clear love and admiration that he had for Kevin Durant's game, and yet the way that he absolutely tore his heart out and tore the heart out of the Phoenix Suns in that opening round series. I think that if I had to name one story of the 2024 NBA playoffs so far, it's Anthony Edwards cementing himself as one of the future faces of the league in a way that, Jalen Brunson has done as well, but, there's something to be said for just the absolute superstar in every possible way you can imagine performance that Anthony Edwards has put on in the playoffs so far.
Yeah, Anthony Edwards is just, he's shaping up to be, he is a once-in-a-lifetime talent, and certainly he's got it, man, and we're watching a superstar right in front of our eyes with Anthony Edwards. All right, so who wins and how many games and why?
Man, this is the hardest series for me to pick. I'm just going to say that up front. I think that this is the series that's most likely to go 7. I think that this is the series that I'm most likely to be wrong about. There's a chance that I'm wrong about all these things, but I think that this is the hardest series for me to call. I'm going to take the safe bet and say Nuggets in 7. It's hard to bet against the defending champs when they're fully healthy, and, this Nuggets squad, has been dominant for quite a while now, but, especially, with the sort of two-headed monster of Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray leading the charge, it's hard to bet against the defending champs in any situation. And, this isn't one of those situations where, the defending champs had a bunch of expiring contracts and it's a completely different team by the next season. No, this is basically the same Nuggets squad that won the championship last season. And it just makes it really hard to bet against them, even though this Timberwolves team is so easy to root for and so easy to want to bet on. I think that the safe choice here is to say that the Nuggets take it. So, again, this is a series that I think is the toughest to call. This is the series that I think is going to be the most fun of this second round of the playoffs, but ultimately I think that the defending champions have just enough to be able to hold off the charge from this incredible Minnesota Timberwolves squad. And, I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being the closest series of the rest of the playoffs, honestly, just given the caliber of the two teams that are facing off here. But I hate having to make a choice. These two teams are so good and they're so closely matched. But if I have to pick one, I'm going to have to say Denver in 7.
Yeah, I think this is going to be the show stealer of the playoffs. Nuggets Timberwolves series along with Knicks Pacers, that those two matchups are going to be the show stealers in this second round. And just a little information to pass along to you is that this will be the third playoff meeting between the Nuggets and the Timberwolves, with each team winning one series apiece. And also, just to pass on some more details about with the Mavericks and the Thunder, this will be the sixth playoff meeting between Dallas and Oklahoma City, with Denver winning 3 out of the first 5 meetings. So that takes care of our preview of the second round in the 2024 NBA playoffs, our second round matchups in the 2024 NBA playoffs. Before we let you go, Nick, the Los Angeles Lakers, after only 2 seasons as the head coach of the team, they fired Darvin Ham. I did not like this move at all, as well as getting rid of firing their entire coaching staff, including Phil Handy. I didn't like that move either. Give me your thoughts on Nick's parting ways with Coach Ham and the rest of the staff.
So I feel 2 different ways about it. I think, first of all, that it was a very hasty decision, but I'm more troubled from the Lakers side of things that it wasn't just that they let go of Darvin Ham. I mean, certainly, some of his answers in press conferences towards the end of the season made it seem pretty clear that he was well aware that he was not going to be coming back. But, I mean, there was essentially a hit piece that came out in The Athletic, throwing Ham directly under the bus, within an hour of the final buzzer sounding on the last game of the Lakers season, which that never sits right with me when, there's sort of a prepared, here's why everything is the coach's fault piece ready to go the minute the season ends. I mean, ultimately, Darvin Ham, I think, did about as good of a job as any coach could have with the roster situation that he was dealing with. I mean, Darvin Ham is not responsible for the way the Lakers roster was assembled, which, once again, for, what feels like, the 4th straight season, basically since that, title run by this Lakers squad, they've just sort of thrown pieces together around LeBron and Anthony Davis and hope that they stick. And, some of them did, certainly. I mean, even though this season was nowhere near as strong for him as last season, Austin Reeves was a big offensive piece for them. D'Angelo Russell, as he's been throughout his career, was inconsistent for the Lakers, but when he was on, he was, a real positive piece for the Lakers squad, also on the offensive end. But again, I mean, for a team that's supposed to be, the best version of a team built around LeBron James, to be 3rd from last, to be 28th in the league in 3-point attempts is just not, I think, proper roster construction. And so for the blame to fall on Darvin Ham, I mean, it feels a lot, honestly, like Rob Pelinka sort of, trying to save his job by finding someone else to blame. But I think, maybe some coaches in the league could have done a slightly better job with this roster, but I don't think this was a championship team no matter who was coaching them. And ultimately, when you're talking about the, what we think are the twilight years of LeBron James's career, which, of course, people have been wondering if these are the twilight years of LeBron James's career for almost a decade now. But, even still, with LeBron at this point in his career, it's pretty well established that, he's at his best when he has a whole lot of shooters to kick out to. And, I mean, for LeBron to, be essentially the, second best 3-point shooter on the team for the vast majority of the season, it just is not a roster that is constructed to best fit, his and Anthony Davis's game. And that should be the entirety of the goal if you are the general manager of the Los Angeles Lakers. So, there's certainly jokes that went around about how, the Lakers were the in-season tournament championship winners. But, ultimately, from my perspective, I think that firing Darvin Ham, I understand it, at least. I didn't feel like it was maybe the right decision given the sort of roster situation that he was dealing with. But firing Phil Handy and the rest of the coaching staff, to me, that just sort of screams front office desperation of, I need someone else for this to be their fault, such that, the blame doesn't fall on me as the head of the front office. So it'll be interesting to see, what Darvin Ham's, coaching future looks like, certainly. But again, I mean, it's one thing to, fire Darvin Ham after some of the inconsistencies the Lakers experienced this season, to fire one of the most respected developmental coaches in the league and Phil Handy along with that, when you're a team that desperately needs to hit on your young players around your superstars, it just didn't make all that much sense to me. So I'm, even more confused than I would have been otherwise. Certainly, it's not the most unexpected thing for Darvin Ham to be fired, but to let go of the rest of the coaching staff along with him, again, just screams of desperation to me, and it'll be interesting to see just how much leeway Rob Pelinka has going forward, given how many times he's now turned over the coaching staff.
Let's just stay with the Lakers for a moment. We know that not just the city of Los Angeles, it's an attractive place, but the Lakers are one of the more attractive teams in all of professional sports. James Borrego, his name has been thrown around. Also, J.J. Redick's name has been thrown around. And also, Mike Budenholzer, his name has been thrown around. He's a former Coach of the Year award winner and also coached the Bucks to an NBA championship. Tyronn Lue, his name his name was thrown around, but the Clippers are expected to give him a massive extension. Jason Kidd, name was thrown in the mix, but the Mavericks have given him an extension. Who do you think is going to be the best fit for this Lakers team, specifically a LeBron-friendly Lakers squad?
Man, that's a tough question. I think of the names you mentioned, I would rather go with Mike Budenholzer. I mean, certainly there's been buzz around, J.J. Redick as someone who could make a first-time leap into head coaching. I don't think that's the kind of coach that you want for this Lakers squad. I think you want to have a coach who, again, with Coach Bud, he's someone who's won a title before. He's someone who's, coached consistently some of the best teams in the league at, getting a lot out of the, ancillary parts. I mean, his Hawk squads that were 60-win teams with, the sort of distribution among the best players on that squad, the Bucks teams that, he coached for so long that did, such a good job of maximizing the parts around Giannis. I think that of the candidates that you mentioned, I mean, I think Mike Budenholzer is the best fit for this Lakers squad. Again, there's a lot of buzz around J.J. Redick, but I'm just not sure that this would be the right situation for Redick to step into, or for any first-time coach to step into. I mean, we just saw with Darvin Ham, how much of a struggle it can be to be a first-time, head coach for this kind of a high-profile Lakers squad. So it'll be fascinating to see what direction the Lakers go. I mean, certainly, one would assume that LeBron and Anthony Davis will have a decent amount of input on who that next head coach would be, but if I were the Lakers, I would definitely be trying to get the most experienced head coach I can. If the Clippers were not talking about extending Ty Lue, I think Ty Lue would be the clear top choice for the Lakers, just given his past history with LeBron and also given what he's done, keeping this Clippers squad, up near the top of the Western Conference for a few years now. So, again, it's going to be fascinating to see what direction the Lakers go, but if I were them, I would definitely try and I would lean towards getting a more experienced head coach rather than sort of trying to spin the wheel on another first-time coach in a J.J. Redick.
The Lakers have an interesting offseason, Nick. LeBron James as the player option. Anthony Davis is going to be guaranteed his money going into next year. Rui Hachimura also is going to be guaranteed money. And also, D'Angelo Russell has a player option. So certainly a lot of questions with the team known as the Los Angeles Lakers. And let's stay just with head coaches. I mentioned his name earlier, Jason Kidd, one of the most highly respected people in the game of basketball, got an extension with the Dallas Mavericks. And it can be challenging at times when you're coaching two ball-dominant stars like Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. But Jason, he's a champion, multiple all-star, and doing his thing as a coach. Give me your thoughts on the Mavericks extending Coach Kidd's contract.
Man, it's interesting. I certainly will admit that I have not in the past been particularly much of a believer in Jason Kidd as a head coach, but he has definitely, we talk about development for players all the time, but certainly Jason Kidd has developed a whole lot as a head coach since his early days, coaching with the Brooklyn Nets. And, he's someone who, again, I mentioned sort of earlier that the Mavericks had a whole lot of, sort of changing around the roster at the trade deadline. They became a much better team after the trade deadline because of some of the players they picked up. But, some of the credit for that has to go to Coach Kidd for, integrating those guys into the rotation, for finding a way for P.J. Washington to be successful after he'd sort of been on the outs for a Charlotte Hornets team that obviously is not exactly in the same echelon of basketball as the Dallas Mavericks are now. And certainly, getting Daniel Gafford and getting the right mix between him and Derek Lively and Moxie Cleaver was not the easiest coaching situation to figure out. And, again, I am interested to see sort of how it goes with the Mavericks. I mean, certainly it seems like, the situation there is more stable for Kidd as the head coach than it had been in some of his previous stops. But, he's grown a lot as a head coach, and certainly he's much better at the job, in my opinion anyway, than he was, even a couple of years ago. And, that's made a huge difference for this Mavericks squad to, be able to sort of lean on him more as he's grown as a head coach. And, it'll be interesting to see where it goes going forward. Certainly it seems like he's going to be the head coach for the Mavericks for a while now, given that he's inked that extension. But I will admit fully that, I did not have high expectations for Jason Kidd figuring it out as a head coach, and he really has figured out a lot in this past year. And certainly the Dallas Mavericks would agree that he's figured out a lot and enough to, award him with that long-term extension.
And I mentioned his name earlier, and we talked about him. Tyronn Lue is expected to get an extension from the Los Angeles Clippers, and this is huge because the owner of the team, Steve Ballmer, listen, we know about his track record as a businessman working with Microsoft, and the Clippers are expected to have that brand new arena in downtown Los Angeles within the next few years. Just give me your thoughts on the Clippers planning to extend Ty Lue.
I think it's the right move. I mean, I think it was the right move for them even before there were the rumblings that the Lakers were, looking to sign him. But, there's an element to which I think that it's the right move for the Clippers to extend Ty Lue because I think he's one of the better coaches in the league. And so I think it makes, sense to lock him down, especially with, the Clippers move to their new arena coming up pretty soon on the horizon. But, even sort of looking beyond that, I mean, I hate, sort of having to acknowledge it, but, there is an element to which it would be worse for the Clippers in terms of PR to lose Ty Lue to the Lakers than to lose him to anywhere else. So, it makes a lot of sense for Steve Ballmer and the Clippers to, as soon as the rumblings came out that Ty Lue might be looked at for the Lakers job to say, no, we want to lock you down. We want to have you be the Los Angeles Clippers coach for the near term, for the future. And, again, it's the kind of situation where, for me personally, I'm much higher on Ty Lue as a coach than Jason Kidd, even with the improvements that I think Jason Kidd has made as a coach. And so for the Clippers to lock down Ty Lue, I think is the right decision for them in a vacuum. But the Clippers aren't operating in a vacuum. They're operating in, the same geographic area as one of the most well-known sports brands in the world in the Los Angeles Lakers. So there's an added element to which it's very important, in my mind anyway, for the Clippers to lock down Ty Lue. So, I think it's the right move for the Clippers, period, but especially with the Lakers rumblings, it's even more important that they lock him up to a longer-term deal fast. So I'm hoping for Clippers fans' sake that Ty Lue deal gets locked up sooner rather than later and that he can be the head coach of this Clippers squad for a long time to come.
Yeah, he's always been around lots of talent as early as far as his coaching career with the LeBron, Kyrie, Cleveland era, and then this current era with the Clippers with Kawhi and Westbrook and Paul George and also James Harden. But they had, as you said, they had to get this deal locked down. It would have been one thing if they would have lost him to the crosstown rival Lakers. And finally, Nick, we know whenever there's a media rights broadcasting deal for a league, it can represent a new change for a network, but can also be a loss of jobs for another one. The NBA media rights deal is on the horizon, and there's a lot of contract talks involving several networks, but one network in particular, TNT, they may be in jeopardy of losing the NBA. This is when you think of TNT or Turner Sports for that matter, they've been associated with the NBA since the 80s. But if you know about Turner Sports, specifically TNT, that studio show right inside the NBA, Ernie Johnson, Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, and Shaquille O'Neal, there's the possibility that TNT could lose the NBA. I pray that this doesn't happen, but, in business, unfortunate with business and contracts, things can take another turn. Give me your thoughts on just how important that studio show is, not just for TNT, but for the NBA and fans like us.
Yeah, it's a difficult sort of situation to wrap your head around because on the one hand, I think it's great that the rights deals for the NBA, in a time where there have been questions about, whether the NBA would be able to get a lucrative media deal in the streaming era, in the era of cable cutting, all of those sorts of things. I think it's fantastic for the future of the league for them to be able to get a deal that, based on the early reporting of what the deal might look like, would be a significant jump in terms of just, the yearly revenue that the league's bringing in, which, of course, means more salary distributed to the players, which, means a rise in salary cap, more opportunity for NBA players to, create wealth for themselves, to create generational wealth in a lot of these cases. I think it's a wonderful thing on that front, but, the downside of that is just as you mentioned, right, of if the rights deal switches, then there's a chance that, the, studio show that really for a whole lot of people was either their introduction to the NBA or, just a mainstay in their NBA lives inside the NBA, if TNT loses those rights, then that's, an unfortunate situation, a show that was a huge part of the NBA landscape for so long, potentially being off the air with them not having the rights anymore, it's a difficult thing to grapple with. But I think ultimately, the league being in a better place overall from the rights deal it's going to be a win, for the NBA and therefore for the NBA fans. For, the bigger the NBA is, right, the more people there are who are loving basketball and invested in basketball and wanting to talk about basketball. And, that's always a great thing, but there's also the element to which a huge part of the basketball conversation might be disappearing with inside the NBA fading away. So, again, I think it's great for the league overall to have this kind of a rights deal discussion where it seems like there's going to be an even larger revenue stream opened up for the NBA and its players, but there's always that difficulty with, the sort of network battle that, a show that's been as iconic in the NBA landscape as Inside the NBA has been for decades now might be on the way out.
It's always tough when there's conversations like this. Hopefully they can work this out, even in the midst of this streaming era where everybody can benefit. Even if you were not a basketball fan, you were still familiar with the studio show of those personalities with Ernie Johnson, Kenny Smith, Shaquille O'Neal, and, of course, Charles Barkley, and hopefully they can work it all out. And certainly what we have currently worked out right now is Nick Agar-Johnson doing some great things over at what he does. And, Nick, again, thank you so much for being on the program. Tell everybody where they can find you on social media, as well as No Ceilings NBA and Kings Weekly or any websites. Let the listeners know that as well.
Absolutely. So you can find me on Twitter at NDA-Johnson, JOHNSON. No Ceilings, NoCeilingsNBA.com, No Ceilings NBA on social, No Ceilings TV on YouTube, and then Kings Weekly Podcast at Kings Weekly Pod, and available wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard it from him. He is Nick Agar-Johnson. He is the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, also editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Nick, as always a blast. Thank you so much again, and if ever you want to come back on, feel free to let us know.
Absolutely, Ed. Always great to talk about basketball with you. It's an exciting time of year, and, yeah, definitely hope that I'll be able to talk with you about some basketball again sometime soon.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the channel. Remember to click like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for watching.